In what I call my pre-Oregon days, I was a professional writer. No, really, I got paid for my articles, and when I wasn't getting paid, I wrote for reasons I could honestly, though pretentiously, describe as pro bono, even charitable. Never heard of me? Unless you were a regular reader of medical or science trade publications, you wouldn't have. And even if you read them, would you notice my moniker under a headline? Probably not. Though we writers like to think our byline stands out like a Broadway marquee, it took me a long time and a lot of running around in Los Angeles to get to the point where I had my name in print enough places and on enough pages to make a living. Just as essentially, I had developed a treasured cohort of scribes just like me, with which I had people to do all that running around. Then my husband got a job in rural Oregon. Slowly but surely things began to change, though I thought at first they'd be oodles better. I'd seen many pictures of professionals, ranging from software engineers to graphic artists who, laptops on their laps, worked on balconies and patios with distant vista views of sandy coastlines or violet mountains. Many of these photos seemed to have been taken in the Pacific Northwest. I couldn't wait for this to happen to me. I'd been working in a corner of my garage in California where I shared space with spiders and ants, which explains the insect-seeking lizard that my daughter valiantly caught after it kept running over my foot. Naturally, it bit her. Unnaturally, we caught it in a jar and took it with us to a nearby hospital where the emergency physician appreciated our quick-thinking actions so that the bite from the tiny reptile could be ruled out as a health threat. Yet even the doctor had never heard of me, despite the fact I told him I knew to do this because I'd written a story about how helpful it is to identify the little varmints that wound us humans, which is easier if they accompany the patient, although usually that means bringing a dead wasp or tick in a plastic bag. We let the lizard go. This incident is one of many that supported my conclusion that though I could consider myself a real writer, I toiled mostly in obscurity. So when I started settling into my new and tiny town, I decided not to mention the fact that the reason my home office light was on at all hours, and I sometimes looked like a bag lady, was because I was writing up a word-fueled storm. When the recession of 2008 hit, sending everything into a tailspin, I scrambled like everyone else. And I sought out colleagues in Oregon like a thirsty person searching for a desert oasis. I grieved for my former peer group back in LA. Where had my identity gone? I chased down every self-described writer I could find. This meant meeting people who thought they should be published but hadn't been, people who had been published but in poetry and literary journals, people who wrote cookbooks, church music, and computer code. I missed my writer friends from bygone days, until I finally met one. It happened when a group began meeting with pie-in-the-sky hopes of forming a new media presence in Portland. A lot of smart, experienced journalists pooled their talent to try to find a way to launch an online enterprise. It basically went nowhere. And nobody much noticed me at those meetings. But I felt I was making headway just by being part of this cadre of newshounds. And then I noticed a guy I thought looked very familiar. Sure enough, it turned out he had been at a broadcast station in Los Angeles, and though our paths hadn't really crossed, we had some common acquaintances. I was giddy. I told him I'd love to get together and talk about old times. What old times, he wanted to know. It was a great question. After all, he and I, as relative strangers, actually didn't have any. So I told him it would be nice to talk about the Smokehouse restaurant in Burbank, where I used to have lunch once in a while with a big news-gathering clan. Or we could compare some of the stories we'd worked on back when press conferences were key to coverage and drew big crowds. This man gave me a look that made me feel like an off-key karaoke singer. "I'm sorry, but I'm not interested in talking about that," he said, though he did so in a kindly way. "Well, I can't seem to get over it," I told him. "I seem to need to revisit it to reinforce who I am is still who I used to be." I said it with a laugh, but I meant it. So did he. He gently shook his head. I mulled this over for quite a while. I'd known people in Los Angeles and now in Oregon who had gotten stuck in yesteryear. Some talked about world events they'd covered as reporters, so long gone that the incidents truly became a piece of history. Others had become minor celebrities as newscasters, and they couldn't seem to stop referencing their time on the air long after they were off it. I didn't want it to be that way for me. Memories should be mental snapshots to propel you forward, not recollections that anchor you in the past. So I stopped my fervent hunt for other journalists, and I redoubled my efforts to find out what the present had to offer in my rural corner of Oregon. And when people ask me, as some have here, why I don't talk about my former life, I just tell them that I was never the kind of writer they would have been likely to hear about, even back in my LA heyday. But the explanation I think is truly accurate sounds more schmaltzy. I'd like to say that my time before moving here should be considered then, and my time living here is now, and that now is my frequent tip to me, to always remind myself that that was then and this is now, and that is how it should be all the time. That is one of many lessons I have learned here in my small town.